Let's take a look at some charts on Stellar for Brave New Coin. So Stellar is back in the news over the past 24 hours because they had a network issue which may or may not have brought the network to a halt. They say that the network's still online, that it's decentralized, and I don't know because I don't use the Stellar network personally, but there were reports of transactions not being sent properly. This goes back to just what is decentralization? What does it mean? Are nodes decentralized? If it's proof of stake or some equivalent, are the validators decentralized? Is there a single point of failure? Do these companies at the top control what is the essence of the network? That is everything that needs to be determined when you're talking about decentralization. Stellar has added more and more functionality on chain with regards to like DEX activity over the past few months, and you see that on the on-chain activity. But my guess is a lot of this activity in the past 24 hours was related to Ripple exploding in price, and Stellar typically sees a jump in activity and price if Ripple does. If we look at their network status website, you have a list of the incidents here. They've had similar issues in the past where things have gone offline or temporarily offline. Not exactly a good look for a decentralized network, but it is what it is at this point, honestly. And if you're unaware, just like Ripple, they have this circulating, non-circulating foundation supply issue where how much is actually circulating, how much is actually being sold, who's selling it, who's benefiting from it. A similar setup to Ripple. Jed McCaleb founded both projects or co-founded both projects. So they're cousins, they're sisters, they're aunt and uncle. They're intimately related. They decided to burn half of the supply. I think it was late 2019 at this point, Q4 2019. And they went from 100 billion to 50 billion, but there's still conversations again back to decentralization and who owns the network and, all that sort of stuff with Ripple is similar issues for Stellar, certainly in the conversation. If we look at some of the DEX numbers, you can see DEX trades, DEX volume, priced in XLM. They have tons of just stuff, random stuff, like Kin. A bunch of stuff I've never seen or heard of before. Not that that's important, but they have a lot of activity here that may or may not be traded elsewhere. I don't know what gets listed here or why. I don't know what most of these are, but anyway, they have a DEX. It does stuff. Waves has a DEX that does stuff. To me, that doesn't really move the needle. I don't care as far as the Stellar token value is concerned. You might be bullish on Stellar, the company, but XLM, the token, I don't know. Do we care if there's a DEX on Stellar? The Stellar people will, but for me, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't move the needle in my mind as far as value is concerned. What I care more about is supply, it's supply and circulation. How much is yet to be sold? This is just like the Link case, just like the Ripple case. If there's constant selling pressure and buying demand isn't keeping up with that, price goes down or price stagnates. Price does nothing, that sort of thing. So you get these peaks of pump and dump type activity when speculation is high, like now for Ripple, for Stellar. And then when it's out of everyone's mind space for a few weeks, it just goes back to, mean reverts to where it was before. So you can look at all the numbers. You can look at all of the total holders, active addresses, that sort of thing. To me, I like the Coinmetrics style data because I can compare that data to everything else. Whereas this data individually for Ripple or Stellar is harder to interpret, relative to everything else. So if we're looking at, one last thing about this, if we're looking at the rich list, you can see the SDF, Stellar Development Foundation, still holds a lot of coin. Some of this is in escrow, some of this is vested, some of this has a job eventually, blah, blah, blah. Some of this is in Binance Cold Storage, Bittrex, Binance exchanges, Kraken. You can go down the list and see all this stuff. But a majority of it, non-circulating or otherwise, is still held by Stellar. If we look at transaction counts in the line here, average transaction values in the fill, this was the big burn in late 2019, which is why the average transaction value jumped way up. And again, is a great illustration of this escrow stuff or this pre-mine token activity all affects on-chain data. So you can't exactly compare this directly to Bitcoin, right? Because all the Bitcoin ever in existence wasn't just created out of thin air and won't affect that on-chain data, whereas Stellar can just get moved by the company, and then all of a sudden the on-chain data is affected dramatically. So like I said, they had a DEX. They do other stuff. I haven't really kept up too much with Stellar in the past couple months, but transactions have exploded on-chain for Stellar, which hasn't really affected the price, arguably. A lot of this stuff, they're up to EOS type transaction numbers, 2 to 6 million, 5 to 10 million. If the transaction fees are basically zero, it's again hard to look at that data seriously. Like Tron's got a bajillion transactions on chain, but who cares? It's free, right? So EOS very similar, Stellar very similar. Whereas you look at ETH transactions, those are prohibitively expensive. That data is much more relevant to interpretation than a transaction that doesn't cost anything. This is way cheaper than Ripple even at this point. If we look at the NVT, inverse metric of economic utility, and active addresses, NVT took a big dip down with that on-chain burn from Stellar, sort of recalibrated and continues to decline. Active addresses way down since they halted proof of stake rewards. And if we zoom in a little bit since 2019, active addresses really haven't done anything. They're maybe up a little bit on a 30-day rolling basis over the past few months. NVT continues to decline to really what is an effective all-time low. If we exclude the very earliest data and that token burn, there's a lot of on-chain activity, but if it's a DEX and not economic token activity, how do you interpret that? Is NVT still relevant in that case? That's a whole nother conversation to consider. So it's hard to look at NVT in this case and think, yeah, this is super bullish, right? It's not really the token as much as it is DEX activity. If you look at Stellar, Google trends since 2017, big jump in the previous all-time high. In price, the current Google trends have risen slightly. It's back in the conversation with Ripple. So you're going to see a lot of press and searches around Stellar and why Stellar is so cheap and where can I buy Stellar and what is Stellar and what is the DEX on Stellar, that sort of thing. All those searches show up here, but that has been declining over the past few weeks. If we move to the technicals, the part that's relevant to me, just like Ripple, the fundamentals on these networks are just complete junk in my opinion. So they're a ledger, they do stuff, they're free, they're cheap, great. I don't really care so much about that. I care about the token technicals more than anything, because the technicals will tell you the important stuff really, because my opinion on the fundamentals, if that clouds the trading of the technicals, then I would never be long Stellar ever. I wouldn't touch Stellar ever, right? So you have to divorce yourself from reality a little bit. Just looking at the 5200 cross on the daily, STR is the ticker on Polo. Polo is the most data on Stellar, I believe, so I'm going to use that for this analysis portion. But the 5200 cross was bearish from basically mid-2018 until early 2020, and it's been bullish since early 2020. Another way to look at this is it's had periods of local lows that broke down and then periods of local highs. It's broke up from that. You may recognize this as some sort of inverted head and shoulders here. There was certainly a failed inverted head and shoulders here. There was actually a failed potential head and shoulders here. So lots of interesting chart patterns going on. There was a massive triangle consolidation here that broke down in 2018 with everything else. But since 2021, Stellar has exploded considerably from 10 cents. So it's up 5x since late October. Looks really good for continuation. I mean, you can't deny the strength of the trend. Path of least resistance is up. It's basically looking like it's going to retest all-time highs. It looks like it has a date with destiny to $1. It's hard to be bearish on a chart that looks like this. Our 5 yearly pivot is at 70 cents. I would certainly feel more comfortable buying a pullback than buying anything up here, but trend is bullish, right? You can't deny that. There's no patterns here. There's no divergence bearish just yet. So this looks good on trend, honestly. 3-day cloud, just to show that the shift since 2018, it was basically below the cloud. Then 2020, it went inside of the cloud. Late 2020 broke out of the cloud. So if you weren't sure, there was a bull trend shift mid 2020, just like the 50 to 200 was bullish since mid 2020. The horizontal support turned resistance, turned support again in 2020, October. So all this makes sense as far as bullish continuation from here on up and where it reversed. The chart looks a lot cleaner than Ripple does too, just to compare the two. Ripple obviously had that SEC legal case open against them, so that's going to affect the chart. But all this looks good. I mean, it's hard to look at this and be bearish. When you're looking at this, you're bearish. When you're looking at this, you're bullish. It's really black and white. Looking at the Stellar BTC chart, however, it's really done a bunch of nothing since 2019. And if you zoom way out, it's down significantly since 2018, where it was above the cloud. Just a clear-cut black and white case again, above the cloud, bullish, below the cloud, bearish. It's entering a transition phase, potentially with a massive upside edge-to-edge move, which would be a 3x from here, potentially. The problem is this whole range, to me, doesn't look like anything. It doesn't look like white coffee and accumulation. It doesn't look like distribution. It doesn't look like any chart pattern. It's just, I can't imagine wanting to trade this unless you're just trading the range where you're selling the highs, buying the lows, and that's it. I mean, it's hard to interpret this as anything other than a random walk where it just retraces the entire range. It's not even a diamond, anything, there's nothing here. There's no there, even on the daily, which is why I have to look at it on the weekly to see some sort of anything. For this edge-to-edge trade, the TK lines are crossed bullish already. So it says you should be out of your short if you're still short. And it looks ready to cross inside of the cloud over the next week to a couple months, with a target being 1800 realistically bare minimum, and then potentially 2400 sats from there. So I can't hide my non-bullishness for the fundamentals of Stellar. The technicals are bullish, you can't deny that. Any sane person looking at this would say similar. On-chain metrics have perked up because of the DEX activity or DEX-related activities, so all of that data is tainted from a pure relative basis on everything else I look at. Unless you're comparing on-chain DEX activity to something like Waves versus Stellar, that's a more fair comparison than something like Stellar versus EOS even, or Stellar versus Tron. That's all I have for this one. Like, dislike, comment, share, subscribe. Get us to 10K subscribers. Let me know what you think about Stellar in the comments below. Are you a Stellar maxi, or are you a Ripple maxi? Or do you just trade the chart? Happy trading.